Today, guys, we are going to be jumping off of
Yes. What's good, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Jumping Off Points, the podcast where we use current events as jumping off points to have conversations about politics and culture. My name is Timber, and I'm here with my main man, Aiden. What are you saying, Aiden?
I'm good, Tim. Yeah, how you doing?
Yeah, very good, man. Very, very sunny weekend in the UK, which means I've got my shorts on. If it's,
I've also got shorts on.
It's very vibes. I feel like I always feel like I'll regret it, but the last few days I've walked home from like myriad places. Well, mostly local places near where I live, and I've been fine.
You've been to a myriad of places this weekend, have you?
Mostly around my local area, yeah, like to the park. Supermarket was one of them.
Yeah.
But I've been fine every time. Like, very, very nice to feel the wind on my shorts whilst it being still sunny.
Good to hear. That is good to hear.
We're going to talk about a policy that's been talked about a lot over the last week, which is the UK government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda.
We'll look at the background to that decision to sign that deal with Rwanda. We'll look at the first flight that was planned for the 14th of June that ended up being cancelled. We're going to talk about the political goals of the Conservative Party around this policy, what they wanted to get out of it. And then we'll open up into a broader discussion about immigration and asylum seeking in the UK. Priti Patel has been the UK's Home Secretary since July of 2019 under Boris Johnson. Interestingly, her parents actually emigrated from Uganda in the 1960s, which is coincidentally a country that borders Rwanda in Africa. In October 2019, she promised that small boat migrant crossings over the channel would be halved by the end of the month. Obviously, she knew that this is a very important issue for Conservative voters. By October 2020, she had vowed to make the crossings unviable and called for all the boats to be turned around at sea and sent back to France. In November 2021, she promised to stop 100% of migrant crossings. Despite her bold pledges, the number of people crossing the channel in these small boats has increased every year since 2019. So essentially, everything that she's done until now has had no effect. Or if it has had an effect, it's made more people cross in small boats, which has been very unpopular with the Conservative base.
Well, this is something that I think we'll definitely get onto as we move further in. But the whole crux of this issue stems around deterrence. What works as a good deterrent to stop people crossing the channel? And I think there is a logic underpinning all of Priti Patel's moves. That is a certain level of hostility in the way they treat them when they arrive will curb the numbers and mean that less attempt to make the journey. But I think that message, however potent it seems in the eyes of the UK voter, is like, oh, well, we're taking action. We're putting out a real signal to them now that means that there'll be less crossings. Doesn't actually land because of the situations these people were already in. And that's obviously something we'll move into as we get further into the podcast. But obviously, a lot of attempts so far to curb the crossings, and none of them have worked.
Yeah. And I also think it's worth mentioning at this point that some people say that a major factor in the increase in these channel crossings was Brexit, because when we were part of the EU, we were also part of a law or a system called the Dublin Regulation, which basically meant that like refugees could be legally returned to other EU countries if they'd first arrived at those countries. Now that we're not in the EU, the UK has no legal right to return refugees to any other EU nations, which some people say has removed a deterrent from people who want to travel here. Personally, I don't want to deter people from traveling here, but I just think that that's an important point to raise about why this increase is happening.
Well, yeah, no more do we have kind of the agreements in place to work as bilaterally on these issues as we used to.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like Brexit throws a spanner in the works of every aspect of policy,
we've become warring neighbours, where it's like we want essentially everyone like low key wants to fuck each other over. It's like, yeah, we want to prove that Brexit works. France like, we want to prove that it doesn't. So it's like
that is basically a summing up of all UK-European relations at the moment, doesn't it?
Yeah. You need a common agreement over frameworks and a way of meshing all these policies together in order for them to work across different terrains in the way they need to for something like immigration, which is it's an international issue. It's not ever going to be confined to one nation.
100%. And if you're going to leave one of those pre-existing frameworks in an isolationist move, you probably want to have people in charge of policy who are at least somewhat competent, but that hasn't happened.
So now on to the actual policy. So in early April 2022, it was announced that Priti Patel had... Did I say Priti Patel? Priti Patel signed a deal. It's not funny when I pronounce it correctly. I did it right the second time.
It wasn't that you pronounced it correctly. It was how hard your face was working to get out the right syllables.
It's like a tongue twister. Home Secretary Priti Patel signed a deal with Rwanda to fly some of the people who illegally arrived into the UK to seek asylum there instead. Now, obviously, this was a really, really big news story because it was so out there as a plan. As Aidan mentioned, there's been lots of efforts to curb illegal immigration via many other means, but I guess they're more things that you would visualize governments doing with their own resources. Sending them to another country, so essentially outsourcing the problem to another nation, is kind of unprecedented.
It's unprecedented in the UK, I think. The Tories basically took inspiration from the Australians, right? Because they have a processing, what's the word? Processing camp? Processing place?
It's like they've got like an offshore place where they process refugees, so they're not actually in Australian territory.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Israel also had a deal with Rwanda in like 2014 or something to send people there as well, which didn't work out as far as I'm aware.
So as I said, unprecedented. There's never been anything even similar. Nothing even remotely close to this.
But I think it's still fair to say it's unprecedented in terms of UK, like definitely in terms of UK policy.
So this decision was met with criticism from civil servants. The top-ranking civil servant issued a letter to Priti Patel, basically saying that whilst they had put everything in place for the policy and they could make the policy happen, they said that the whole success of the policy hinged on it being a good deterrent. So the policy works from a monetary standpoint if it deters migrants from crossing the channel. If it does not do that, then it's more expensive than what we're doing at the moment. And part of the decision-making process for any policy like this, for the civil servants and definitely the top-ranking one who's in charge of implementing it, is they've got to sign off on the fact that it gives good value for money and it's the best that can be done in the circumstances.
My understanding is that the Conservative argument for why this needs to happen, this Rwanda policy, there's basically two reasons. One is to deter people from making this crossing in small boats from France to England, like over the ocean, basically. And because that is dangerous, like quite a few people have died making that crossing, and it's generally organized by criminal gangs. And the second one is that they say the UK just doesn't have the resources to support the number of refugees that are arriving via that route.
So the reason why I would say the top-ranking civil servant is the most important criticism is because due to the fact that they lodged this official objection to the policy, Priti Patel had to do a ministerial decision to push the policy through. And what that means is Priti Patel is now directly responsible to Parliament for the success of the policy. It would otherwise be the top-ranking civil servant who would be called upon to defend it after its implementation. But it's now Priti Patel herself. Since she's done so many things in the past, putting her kind of neck out, saying, I'm going to cut it by 100%, maybe this is just another in the long line of bold decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that for her, she's already, to the Conservative base, accountable for dealing with this problem. A part of her problem is that she came in swinging about this. Like, she was basically chosen to be the Home Secretary because she has such a bolshy, like, strong way of presenting herself in the press and talking about these issues. And to be honest, she's massively overpromised to the Conservative base. And if she doesn't do something about it with success, they will turn on her because this is the main issue that they want sorted. And so far, she's made no progress on it. Let's see how that goes for her. I'm not crossing my fingers for her because I don't like her.
So I don't have a job where I'm in front of the press or where I'm like in government. But if
probably for the best.
if I had a job at work that was like, can you prevent like this error from happening, do something to stop it, I wouldn't say to the team, I will cut it by 100%. 100%. Not one will be made in the next year under my reign. It's like, it just seems incredibly ballsy.
And also, how does anyone hear her say that and be like, cool, I believe it. She's going to do it. She's going to cut out 100% of these crossings.
Yeah. Listen, I'm going to cut the amount of people coming here by 1,000 billion million %. And it's sort of like, oh my God, even more. She's going to cut it even more. Gone even higher than 100. This is crazy.
She's even more conservative than she was before. I love it.
She's overpowered now. She's overpowered. She's more conservative than me. I don't like her. So yeah, that was one bit of criticism they received. There's obviously a lot of agreement within the Conservative Party itself. I know that different MPs have been interviewed on radio, and if they're not fervent Brexit MPs who are adamantly for the policy, there's other MPs who will say, well, this is the right thing to do in this circumstance. We finally have a solution to this problem. But again, they're towing the party line as they must, because this is obviously it's a big policy.
Also worth mentioning that a recent YouGov poll found that 44% of UK citizens support this policy and only 40% of UK citizens oppose the policy. So it does seem to be quite popular with the public, unfortunately.
So all of that is the context for the event that actually happened this week. Jumping off point. Shall I play a sample when I say that? Shall I do it? Is that zany?
Well, let's see what it sounds like, but yeah, throw it in.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I will do that. On the 14th of June, which was last week, a Boeing 767 chartered at an estimated cost of £500,000 was due to take off from a military airport in Wiltshire to take the first group of asylum seekers over to Rwanda. So finally, this policy actually coming into fruition and a very key date for backers of the policy.
Originally, the government had planned for there to be 130 people on this plane. But then after a series of legal challenges, on the Friday before, we were down to 31 people on the plane. And then on the day, the number was reduced to just 7 people. Leading up to that day, as that number reduced, lawyers for 2 refugee charities argued that the policy was unlawful. Unfortunately, their bid was rejected by a High Court judge who ruled that there was material public interest in allowing the Home Secretary to implement immigration control decisions.
Which I kind of get to an extent. I think the judge will be very cautious about setting a precedent where the legal court of appeal can suddenly overrule a ministerial policy. You can imagine there's all sorts of reasons why you'd be very cautious about that.
I mean, big fans of democracy here on the pod. The Conservatives are a democratically elected government. So the argument is there that this is the will of the people. And you don't really want the courts to unnecessarily block democratically elected government's policies, unless there's a very strong case for that policy being unlawful.
All of this leads up to the actual day of the flight then. You've got 7 people, bless them. I would hate to be one of the 7 left after all of the other people got exempted for various reasons.
I think they actually put them on the plane, didn't they?
Yeah.
People actually got onto the plane at this airfield in Wiltshire or whatever. And as far as they knew, they were going to Rwanda.
So on that day, there was an intervention from the European Court of Human Rights. So it's the Strasbourg court, which has the final say in like all human rights issues. They ruled that one refugee claimant had raised genuine concerns about the scheme and that the government had not properly looked into conditions in Rwanda. Basically, because the European Court of Human Rights stepped in, it then gave grounds to all the rest of the 7 on the plane to be exempted from the flight also.
I think it gave them the precedent to appeal. Right.
Yes.
And that meant that the flight couldn't go ahead because they still had legal avenues open to them, I guess.
So all of this leads to the $500,000 chartered plane just going back to Spain. And that money is gone. The money, it wasn't like money based on the policy being delivered and the plane going there. That's been spent now.
How many refugees do you think you could put up for a year with £500,000? Probably a few.
Yes, probably a fair few. Yeah,
probably a few.
Yes, it's a big waste of taxpayers' money, given that it didn't deliver anything or do anything for anyone.
So a lot of the appeals via these legal challenges were made on the grounds that Rwanda doesn't have a great history of upholding human rights, basically.
Or present. History or present of upholding human rights, as the case is.
True. People who are labelled an enemy of the state, who are often just journalists or political opponents of the party in power, which is, what is it called? The People's Patriotic Front? Is that something like that, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's patriotic, which sounds very British, actually. Now that
yeah,
you say
it does. It's weird that Priti Patel's got on so well with them, isn't it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The Rwandan authorities often use excessive force with refugees on the grounds that they've been caught spreading false information.
It's worth saying as well that a lot of the asylum seekers who come to the UK come because they are fearing reprisals by their own government. They are dissidents. They are people who have been opponents of the government or who the government have put a target on for unrelated reasons to anything this person might have done, because of a family they belong to or because of who they are. Sending them to another country where they would have the same unfair treatment as they would in where they've come from doesn't really make any sense. Added to the fact that they then have less protections from their own government if they're still coming after them.
Yeah, definitely. It's hard to imagine Rwanda taking those threats seriously when they also do this kind of thing to their own people. Yeah, it seems dangerous. Like, I think the Patriotic Front won the last election with a 99% share of the vote.
Oh, well, I take back my criticism then. They've obviously doing something right.
And they changed the law, the constitution or whatever, to allow the current president to have a third term. So I don't actually know a lot about Rwanda, but that seems to have the heirs of an authoritarian regime to me. And I just think it's not a great indicator of, the system where we're hoping that these people who are desperate and vulnerable are going to thrive. It just doesn't seem like it mirrors the values of the UK.
Mm. The other component to the human rights concerns of what's going on in Rwanda are that they have a very bad track record on like gay and transgender people. There's been reports come from prisons. If you're gay or transgender, you aren't treated the same as the other prisoners. You are beaten by the security officers. Well, I think what I read was you're beaten at a higher rate than the other prisoners. So it sounds like everyone's getting badly treated anyway. And obviously in places where, asylum seekers would be held, you are at the whims of the people who looking after you in custody. This is kind of a top-down thing also, because officials accuse people who are LGBT in Rwanda of not representing Rwandan values. And therefore, by virtue of their identities, they're afforded less protections anyway in this society.
Yeah, I mean, that sucks.
Yeah.
As we mentioned earlier, Brexit tends to creep into all policy discussions, UK politics, because it's just such a prominent dividing line in public opinion. When we left the EU, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, said, we cannot sustain a parallel illegal system. Our compassion may be infinite, but our capacity to help people is not. The British people voted several times to control our borders, not to close them, but to control them. So whether or not that's working out for him, I don't think it is. But when Brexit was being debated, there was obviously a lot of talk about immigration, and a lot of people who voted Brexit did so in order to curb immigration, as they felt that the UK wasn't able to handle the amount of people that were arriving here.
Well, also Brexit was the time when Conservatives managed to like a big blob creature just step to the side and gazump all the UKIP voters. So a lot of those new voters in the Tory faction now were previously members of like further right parties, but have consolidated. The Tories have managed to consolidate them as one of their voting blocks. Now, the Tories will be very aware of the fact that they're in a precarious position with these voters. They don't match their values culturally in many ways. Immigration is the one issue where they kind of see eye to eye on them. So if they don't give them a win or something that makes them feel like their votes for the Conservative Party have come to fruition in something, they're at a very high risk of never seeing those voters again, which, to be honest, arguably I think could happen anyway, now that Brexit has been passed.
I actually going to make a bold statement and think it will happen. Nigel Farage he never goes away. Like he has been, so Nigel Farage is the guy who used to run UKIP and subsequently ran, I think, the Brexit party. He's kind of the main figure to the right of the Tories, who is very good at commanding a lot of popular support for very right-wing ideas.
Well, not just that, he's big connection guy. Like he has like direct he has a direct line to the Murdochs, basically. So even in terms of, I guess, kingmakers who are higher up than the Conservative Party, Nigel has an in there that allows him to I guess steer public opinion. So he's someone who you can see him talking about an issue and it'll be throughout the whole of the mainstream press, like the next few days.
Also, he has a huge advantage over Boris Johnson in that he never has to deliver on policy promises. All he has to do is stoke up division and hatred, and he gets a swell of support. Part of what's happening is that Boris Johnson and his cabinet have rose to extreme popularity in 2019 through the rhetoric of populism. Massively overpromising, as we've seen with all the Brexit promises that never came to fruition, and through Priti Patel's language about immigration that clearly hasn't been followed through with any working policy.
See, Nigel Farage can easily say from the sidelines, "I will reduce it by 100%. I'll reduce it by 1,000,000%." He
doesn't even need to say that he'll do it. All he needs to say is it's still happening. Like, you know what I mean? Because I'm not in power. All he's saying is like, the boats are still arriving. We're still paying millions of pounds for these people to come here, etc., etc. He doesn't actually have to defend a policy that he's working on.
True.
So I think eventually people are going to get sick of these empty promises from the Conservatives, and they're going to say they don't care about our hard right issues. They just say they do to get our vote. We're going to go back to Nigel Farage, and I think we'll see the third coming of Nigel Farage.
So another thing that feeds into the Brexit debate is that since the European Court of Human Rights struck down, or rather gave legal grounds to exempt the asylum seekers who were on the plane, Boris has indicated a desire to leave the European Court of Human Rights, so withdraw from that system entirely. Now, a lot of people are looking at this as sort of political gamesmanship, because again, feuding with the European Court of Human Rights is good red meat for his hard right base.
Because they think it sounds like we're leaving the European Union again.
Now, obviously, the European Court of Human Rights is an entirely different thing to the European Union. And indeed, the UK were one of the main players who set up the European Court of Human Rights in the 1960s. But I think for the average person, it sounds very EU-y. So I think as long as there's this unifying force of a big enemy to combat, and indeed that plays so well into populist rhetoric. Here's a problem which is so sellable. We, as the UK, want to do this policy. The European Court of Human Rights on their pedestals in their ivory towers are stopping us, looking at us in that patronising, feministy way, and saying, "No, you can't do that. Sorry."
I think it's basically having a boogeyman who you can claim is the reason why this policy isn't a huge success, because I think it's pretty clear that it's going to be difficult and expensive to make this policy a genuine success in the ways that they want it to be. So if they can blame their not having any immediate success on this European court, that's just great for them, because they don't have to defend the policy. They can just have a go at the people who aren't letting them enact it in the way that they want.
I mean, you can even imagine this being like a big party slogan, can't it? Like, punch back at the European Court of Human Rights, who want to tell you what to do, who want to tell you how to run your country when they're all the way over there in Europe. Like that. That's kind of perfect, isn't it?
Yeah. But would be absolutely batshit insane to actually leave this court, right?
Yeah.
So at the moment, Boris Johnson and his cabinet are involved in yet another Brexit-themed squabble with the EU over the Irish border. They're basically trying to rewrite the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's essentially a sort of trade policy that dictates where goods are checked between Britain and the EU. And Northern Ireland this is a really important issue there, because a significant portion of the country think that Northern Ireland should remain part of the UK, and a significant portion think Northern Ireland should leave the UK and become part of the Republic of Ireland, which is still in the EU. And there's a thing called the Good Friday Agreement, which is basically a peace settlement between these two factions of Northern Ireland. The UK's membership in the European Court of Human Rights is an essential part of the Good Friday Agreement. Everyone knows, including Boris Johnson, that if we were to pull out of that court, they would have to renegotiate the Good Friday Agreement, which is completely in contrast to what he's trying to do with the rewriting of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which, because his defense of what he's doing there is that he's trying to preserve the sanctity or like effectiveness of the Good Friday Agreement because he doesn't want war. So these two policies are in contrast with each other if he was to try to pull out of this court.
And I also don't think Boris is a guy who wants to give himself loads of agreements to renegotiate and re-sign, because part of the agreements that have been made for Brexit that came out of the oven, we were told, and were ready to go, have all massively backfired over the last few months, or come entirely unraveled because of events that the government didn't foresee.
They were the opposite of oven ready. They were still in the freezer. They hadn't even been.
Yeah.
The tomatoes hadn't been sliced.
Well, that's it. The last thing that Boris Johnson will want to do is give himself extra homework on extra agreements that he didn't even need to renegotiate, but now he does. So I don't think that's actually going to happen. But again, it's just prime fodder.
An important part of the government's framing of this Rwanda policy is that it's to tackle illegal entry to the UK. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because surely the system is, if you're being persecuted somewhere, you arrive at the place that you wish to seek asylum, and then you file your application to seek asylum there, and they make a decision on it. I'm not sure why it matters how you arrive.
So this is it. So it matters for your own safety.
Of course.
Because it's obviously, you don't want people attempting the crossing. But here's the problem. In the UK, we don't have any system where you can do a visa application as an asylum seeker from a war-torn country and then patiently wait to hear back from the government and come here. According to the Red Cross website, there is no visa you can apply for to claim asylum in the UK. That doesn't exist. So there are work visas you can apply for, but again, then we enter into the realm of, it's not really asylum seeking, it's immigration. So if you're in a country where you're not fearing persecution, yes, there are ways to apply and then come. But if you're an asylum seeker, there is no way to apply and then come.
Yeah.
You can only arrive illegally. If that's the framing of arriving by boat is illegal, unless you're a very rich asylum seeker, which runs counter to many of the baggages you would expect an asylum seeker to have, having fled their country with only the bare necessities of what they could take with them and all of that stuff. You're probably not going to be then.
Not everyone's rich. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whether you're rich makes no difference on whether or not you need to seek asylum.
Well, there's another strand as well, which is that if you, as many asylum seekers are, fleeing because of political persecution, you're on some list in your country where you can't use planes. You can't ride the train. You would be picked up and you would be sent to prison. So necessarily, they're making journeys in the back of lorries over borders. They're doing whatever they can to avoid detection.
Yeah. It says on the government's website that one of the ways that you can apply to seek asylum is that when you arrive in the UK, or as soon as you think it would be unsafe for you to return to your country, you make your application.
So the government in its official messaging is like, here's how you make an asylum claim. You arrive here and then you claim. Yeah. Whereas then in their messaging to the public, it's like, all these people are illegally arriving. It's like, well, if they're filing asylum claims, then they're not illegally arriving. It's only illegal if they've already been denied entry for whatever reason.
So really, the only part that is illegal is not arriving, it's traveling over the channel in a small boat. If someone's doing it out of desperation, it's not causing you any trouble. The only thing that's happening that's bad is that, well, obviously this is not a small issue, but some of those people are dying or getting injured. That's not causing you problems. That's causing them problems. So why is that not being treated with sympathy as opposed to aggression? Do you know what I mean? If the only illegal part is because of their own safety, why is that something that we need to be angry about? Make it safer. Let's just make it safer.
This is something I've thought about a lot, is that whenever someone has a political position that is cruel towards someone else, they never frame it as cruelty. So let's say you're someone who hates trans people. You won't say you hate trans people. You'll say you're trying to protect women. If you're someone who hates a certain race, you'll say, I'm just fighting for the rights of insert whatever your own race is. And it's like this with the immigrants crossing the channel. It's, I'm trying to protect them. I'm trying to protect them by not letting them come over here. And, or they'll say, I'm not, I want to be kind to them, but we have enough problems here with homeless people. We should be looking after our own homeless people. So it's always portrayed as this positive thing. But I don't think anyone's fooled that the actual fact of the matter is that you don't like the people coming. And that's another part of the Rwanda policy. The Rwanda policy, clearly, we're still spending a lot of money. All of your arguments are about, we need to give that money to English people, we need to do stuff to the British economy, and yet we're still spending that money, but they're in Rwanda, and you're happy with that outcome.
There's definitely a level of deceit in the messaging around this, because the reason the Tories are actually doing this policy is because their voters massively want this immigration issue to be sorted. And the reason their voters, well, this I'm obviously speaking very generally, but the sense I get is that the reason their voters want this issue sorted is because they feel there's a level of unfairness about how well people arriving are being treated compared to them. They subscribe to a narrative that people are coming here, they'll be given shed loads of cash, whilst people around are living on council estates in poverty, and they feel that that's unfair. But the government aren't framing it like that. The government are framing it like, we need to stop these people from dying in the ocean, and we need to stop the business model of these criminal gangs who are putting people on boats. But the two don't line up.
Everything that we've said about protecting them, about giving more money to British people, doesn't really work, because we're not giving any more money to British people in this circumstance. We're actually spending more money at the moment in the short term to send them there. As you've said, I think what you've said is the main one, is that it's an unfair treatment. They shouldn't get things when I don't get things. But then there's another one, which is, people just generally, some people are uncomfortable with having people of other countries who are brown-skinned coming to the UK and being here. So sending them to another place means that they're not here anymore. They're asylum seekers who we're essentially still giving a lot of money to, because we are, but they're not in England anymore. They're in an African country.
I mean, I think you see that clearly in the difference in attitude between refugees from Ukraine and Hong Kong and refugees who arrive in boats who are generally from Syria, Afghanistan, places in the Middle East. Yeah. I also think it's a bit of a shame that those people who see that supposed unfairness think that the answer is to stop someone else getting something that they need, rather than lobbying the government for better provision for themselves. Do you know what I mean? Why is it not, I'm angry at the government for not spending enough on kids, on disabled people, on people who are out of work, rather than, I'm angry at the people who are getting money, who are clearly desperate and vulnerable. It's a bit of a shame, I think.
Yeah.
As we mentioned earlier, the Conservative arguments for the necessity of this scheme are essentially, one, as we just mentioned, that the crossings are dangerous and human smuggling gangs need to be stopped. And two, the UK doesn't have the resources to support the number of people arriving. So let's examine that.
Yeah, we want to basically comb over this resources argument a lot, because I think it's the poorest part of this plan. I would say it's the biggest dropped ball of this whole thing. And as you'll see, a complete gamble. The government says the current asylum system costs the taxpayer £1.5 billion per year. The cost to send asylum seekers to Rwanda is a multi-layered cost, which is ever growing and sprawling in complexity. So the initial agreement that we've done with Rwanda costs an upfront 120 million, which is a lot less than 1.5 billion. However, the UK government has also said that it will pay for the processing and integration costs for each relocated person in Rwanda. So the 120 million is just extra on top of paying the same amount of money still, but to the Rwandan government.
Isn't the 120 million upfront payment, isn't that sort of almost like a gift, isn't
It's-
it? Like,
it's just-
isn't it like for
it's
the
just-
economic development of Rwanda? It's not really. Yeah,
The 120 mil is just a gesture of goodwill.
yeah.
So first thing, we're not saving any money. As highlighted by the top-ranking civil servant, the plan only works if we start seeing, instead of 10,000 migrants crossing the channel, we start seeing 100. We start seeing 50. Then the plan works because we send those 50 to Rwanda, one chartered jet. Easy, done. If they continue in the same number, we're sending lots and lots of chartered jets to Rwanda constantly, whilst also paying for all of their costs. The same cost that we were paying England, but to the Rwandan government. Now, the next aspect of it is that I think when you talk about money in this sense, I would always be skeptical when someone throws out a big figure and says, this cost the taxpayer this amount of money. Because it always sounds like some ridiculous amount that you as an average person will never see in your life. Like you will never see like a 1.5 billion pound bag. You'll never ever get close to that over all your earnings. But for the government,
You're not on that Sigma grind hustle.
I'm like a beta administrator is how I define my political identity and my working style.
Tim wakes up 8:45 every morning. He goes out to buy himself a latte and avocado on toast. Then he goes home, watches Netflix that he pays for every month.
Thank God I'm not in charge of the asylum system. So yeah, you will never see $1.5 billion in your life. In terms of the actual budgets governments have, these are not these astronomical figures that they sound like to you when they're thrown out of context. So the Home Office had a budget of 15.3 billion in that year, where they spent 1.5 billion on the asylum system.
Also, I know that the system used to be that asylum seekers, when their asylum application was successful, they had indefinite leave to remain. And some years ago, they changed that rule so that now it lasts for 5 years and then you have to reapply. And obviously, handling those applications every 5 years instead of just once in a lifetime makes a lot of work. So, it adds loads of extra applications into the backlog, which means you need loads of extra people to do that work. And that means that the cost is a lot higher. So there are things that could be done to reduce the cost of that asylum system, but it would involve taking a more liberal approach to asylum applications than the current government wants to do.
Well, this was something I read. Like the backlog of asylum claims is part of the problem, and part of the solution would be training up more judges, solicitors, funding the legal system that processes these claims, because the amount of money we funnel into like facilities management for holding these people while they wait for periods of like 2 years, like we're talking like a long time waiting for their claims to be processed. That is part of the cost. It's a massive part of the cost, and it's only gone up due to these like different ways of handling it that I don't think have increased our expediency and like dexterity as like a government process, basically.
And yeah, so like if those people who are basically kept in limbo for 2 years whilst they waited for their application, if they actually only had to wait, say, 3 months, after that 3 months, they could start integrating into society and going to get a job, not relying on the state for their welfare and contributing to the economy. So it's sort of the backlog. That's a big part of the financial issue, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I don't know. I think there's a way of selling that to Brexiteers, where you say we're like, we can get them out of here quicker if we process them, but the actual underlying argument is like, but they'll get accepted. But but process them quicker is still, I don't know. I think there's a hard right argument in there somewhere. But
I think it's not about hard right. It's just like, is the taxpayer getting good value for money out of this government's handling of this issue?
And then so the other thing is that we have like a case study of sorts for a situation of a much bigger magnitude in the last 7 years. Feels more recent to me, but that's because I'm getting into my 30s now. The days are starting to blend together a little bit. But in 2015, 2016, we obviously had like the much bigger migrant crisis that affected all of Europe, but especially countries like Sweden and Germany. So Germany in that time accepted 1.15 million refugees. So to put that into perspective, their population is 81 million. So they're essentially seeing an increase of 1.5% of their population coming into the country. That is an insane amount of people.
Is that in 1 year?
Over the 2 years.
Over 2 years, yeah.
So it's an insane influx of people for a country even of their size.
And to put that in context, how many refugees do we take in per year in the UK? Do you know?
So to put that into context of our situation, in 2021, there were 48,540, which represents 0.07% of our 68.2 million population. We're not that much smaller than Germany. Like we're not like a minuscule fraction of the size of Germany. And we're seeing so much less. We're seeing so much less arrivals. And yet we're being told the system can't handle it, which leads me to make the very patriotic argument of why are we letting Germany kick our asses? Like why? Why? Like why? Why can't we do it? Like what? And I think Boris Johnson said, well, that's like almost the population of Sunderland coming in. It's weird because I think Sunderland's population is way higher than that. So that is wrong on the technicality anyway. But the way they talk about it paints this vivid image of like, imagine the whole town of Sunderland descending upon a certain place in the UK. That would be crazy. But obviously, we're talking about people arriving over the course of a year, 0.07% of our population being settled all over the 100% of land that we have, different places that we have in the UK. If we look at what's actually happened with Germany then, since 2015, 2016, the unemployment rate is more than 4 percentage points below the weighted average for the rest of the EU 28 countries. So they have less unemployment than so many European countries, despite having been the people that accepted the most refugees. Their per capita income growth completely held up even during the immigration surge, averaging 1.4% per year.
So basically, I think what we can take from that is if, for some reason, these 50,000 asylum seekers arriving to the UK each year is causing unemployment, or there is also unemployment, we need to investigate what government policies there are that means that we have high unemployment, because it can be done. Germany's doing it. They're taking in many more people, and their economy is doing better than ours is right now. The UK is the only majorly developed economy that isn't growing right now, apart from Russia, which is under sanctions from basically the rest of the world. So I think it would be very convenient for the Conservatives to blame any kind of economic issue on the arrival of migrants. But I think really it looks like we need to examine other government policies if we want to understand why that is.
The prevailing argument for housing asylum seekers and accepting them that any economist would agree with is that they cost a lot in the short term, but then over the long term, they end up being very economically productive for a society. And that's for various reasons.
I think one of those reasons is that they tend to be younger people. So they add to the working age population of a country because they work large parts or possibly their whole career in that new country. They pay taxes in that country for years and years to come.
And it's especially important in countries like the UK, where we're just like got bare old biddies. We've got like a lot of old people.
We have an aging population, which also costs money for us to support. And it's essential that we have younger working people in order to firstly do the work, but also pay the taxes that support those people.
Yeah, for sure.
I think we're almost done discussing the UK's decision to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. Might leave you with a quote. Enver Solomon, the chief executive of the Refugee Council, said, "It's appalling that this government is intent on treating men, women and children who have fled war, bloodshed and persecution as criminals. This draconian and punitive approach not only shows no compassion for very vulnerable people, it will also do nothing to deter those who are desperately seeking safety in the UK." And I think that is probably true. It's, as we said earlier, it's too early to tell yet whether when the flights actually start going across with people, if that happens, whether that will actually have a deterrent effect. But so far, there has been no deterrent. And even the Daily Mail ran with a headline last week saying, "Migrants landing in Britain will refuse to board Rwanda flights and warn policy won't stop them crossing the channel, as 677 arrive in the last 2 days."
There's an argument of pragmatism against this plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda, in that it only works if it deters them from crossing, of which we have no metric or we have no evidence to go off the back of to suggest that's going to be the case. And it's costing us absolutely loads of money in the short term. And indeed will continue to cost us more and more money the more asylum seekers they take, because we're paying for their case to be processed. So those two quotes both bordered on that as the pragmatic argument.
And there's also a moral one, obviously, which is that we're talking about desperate people who've suffered great hardship, and we're basically just refusing to take responsibility for their care.
So, yeah, the alternative is that we accept these asylum seekers. We say that we're not anywhere near the level that we would be at to start turning them away. I think we do have some idea of what that level is, but 0.0% expansions in the population is not the level.
Like, surely you should be saying, yes, this is the place you want to come. This is a great place to live. This is where we have welfare systems, and this is where we look after people. Not, oh yeah, this is a great place to live. I'm keeping it all for myself. Fuck off, you bastards.
If you should go round to these asylum seekers' houses and try and get them to be Brexiteers. You know, you could convert them into another voting bloc if you would just treat them as equals.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea for the Tories.
You should go and try and get some more Brexiteers for your cause. Like, tell them all the shit about the EU. They'll love that shit. They'll love it.
They'll love it. So thanks for listening to the 4th episode of Jumping Off Points. A bit more of a serious topic today. Hopefully you're okay listening without the constant interjection of terrible jokes.
Dude, don't say that. That makes it sound like we've got bad jokes, which we don't.
The interjection of Tim's terrible jokes. My jokes are normally great. So
I think we all know the truth. But yeah, Safe. Thanks everyone for joining us. We will, as usual, not operate or abide by any schedule, no matter what our 5 or 6 listeners want. So see you next time.
And sorry in advance if we mispronounced anything this week. We're on 3 for 3 so far, mispronouncing stuff in every episode, but really hoping that today we've smashed it.
There's a hardcore faction of pedants in the audience, and they swoop in on every single one.
They love to see us fuck up. They love it.
But Safe. All right. Thanks, everyone. Catch you in a bit.
Jumping off the